Chapter 4. Peter's Story. Solo's mission in London was to get close to Peter Amobi, since he had met him years ago in Nigeria with his late father. But there was much more Solo would come to learn about his fellow countryman that would inevitably drive them closer together. They had much in common beyond the country of their birth. Amobi was the second son of a wealthy and well-connected, but otherwise unremarkable Nigerian tribal leader. His name meant, "Who knows the heart of man?" What possessed his family to give him such a name, he was never quite able to fathom, but growing up in a fast-expanding Lagos, he led a pampered and easy existence. Life was great there in the 1970s, especially if you had money, and it seemed his family had an endless supply of it. He went to a local international school where he excelled at maths and English studies. Strangely enough, English literature held great fascination for him, and he wanted more than anything to explore the head of the Commonwealth. Was it true that London's streets were paved with gold? With just reasonable A-level results in maths and English literature, he was not able to get into any of the top-tier English universities, but he did manage a place at Westminster University to read business studies. He found the course ridiculously easy compared to his A-level studies and wondered why. Surely universities are supposed to be the highest seats of learning. Amobi had a generous allowance sent every month to his personal account at Barclays Bank in Marylebone High Street, the closest branch to his university, which was scattered across various buildings and not on a single campus. Without many ideas as to which career to follow upon graduating, with moderate success, despite an effortless ability to calculate very fast, Amobi drifted around Europe for most of the summer months. Finding himself in Saint-Tropez with some fellow Nigerians a year or two older than him, provided him with a suggestion. "Why don't you come and try forex trading with me at Halliburton Securities?" a Nigerian friend suggested. "It's not a big operation, but it gives great bonuses if you make them good money. That's who I paid for this trip. The Byblos ain't cheap, you know." The Byblos Hotel was certainly not cheap. Peter had gasped at the price for a bottle of scotch in their nightclub, Les Caves du Roi. Even with his generous allowance, Amobi would never manage to stay there and treat the myriad of well-tanned honey blondes packing the Les Caves to their cocktails of choice. The idea of making some real money from forex, which he basically knew was currency trading, seemed like a great bet. Anyway, why not try it, Peter thought. Joining Halliburton had not been easy. His friend had given him a huge build-up. Son of a Nigerian leader, maths genius, and jolly good all-round sport. Soon passing his FSA, the Financial Services Authority, exams with ease, Amobi was now officially part of the city establishment and able to benefit in full from the Big Bang when restrictions on all kinds of trading were finally removed. Huge money flowed into the coffers of the myriad of British and foreign-owned banks. Risk and reward were considered synonymous, while huge annual bonuses were handed out based on a department's performance. Amobi was so successful that it seemed he had the Midas touch, and when he was offered a move to VP on Merrill Lynch's African investment team, he grabbed it with both hands. Although his base salary was a paltry $750,000 per annum, he would have a good chance to make a bonus of several times that and lead a much quieter life. A life more focused on M&A work and some consultancy for African governments that were clients of ML. Taking the readily available British passport, he made the obligatory trip once a year to Nigeria. Every year, his father and mother lined up several highly eligible Nigerian maidens they would try to marry him off to. It was on one of these trips that he first met Solo's father, the well-known and much-loved general and tribal leader from the Delta region. He had returned home to find his father taking a glass of beer with the general on their large garden terrace, overlooking their lush and well-tended back garden. For some reason, he laughed to himself at that moment, remembering that in US English, the Americans would call this expanse of succulent greenness a backyard. What a stupid way to describe a green garden, he thought. Yards are normally expanses of concrete. As he strolled over to the two men, he was introduced to the general, who asked him directly what was making him laugh. Amobi told them, and they guffawed with derision at the example of such different vocabulary. The general went further and pointed out that if the young Amobi were to show a photo of the said garden to his colleagues at work in London, they would probably call it a jungle. Amobi was to meet the general several times on his visits to his homeland, and it was clear that he was one of his father's closest friends. A few years later, and now head of emerging markets at Deutsche Bank, with complete autonomy over his team and their activities, he was already a very rich man. His deal, on top of a base salary of several $1 million a year, was 20% of his department's gross revenue. As that was adding anything up to $15 million a year, even after a hefty tax bill, he was coining it. Earning much more than the bank's German CEO and snooty chairman, there was plenty of friction at that level to deal with. It took a toll on him emotionally, and the short marriage he had with a famous French model deteriorated at the same time. He had to find another way to live. Despite all the money, power, and freedom to roam the world, looking for emerging market deals where his reputation preceded him, he felt he needed a change. The opportunity came from an unexpected direction when he received a call from his homeland, from one of the government ministers he had dined with on a previous trip. He assumed they wanted to enlist his bank to arrange the new government bond issue they had discussed over that lunch a couple of weeks earlier. He hoped so, as the fees alone would boost his department's earnings for the year by at least $80 million. Moreover, placing a strong economy's government bond was a piece of cake. He hoped the minister was not going to ask for a kickback, as he had made it clear that both he and the bank had a very clear policy about such things. Neither would even contemplate it, despite the huge fees on the table. Amobi was in for a surprise. He was offered the chance to become CEO of the biggest commercial bank in Nigeria, to take it into the 21st century and make it the leading African bank. His pay package would be considerably less than that he currently enjoyed at Deutsche Bank, but he did not need more money right now. What he wanted was some stability in his life, so he took the job, kindled a latent interest he had always had in the Catholic Church, and even allowed his family to find a suitable bride for him, more to please them than anything else. It was at his big, fat Nigerian wedding that he first met the young Solo, who was there with his father, simply known to everyone as the General. Facebook was already rampant in Lagos amongst the younger professional class, so he was not surprised, during his short honeymoon in Cape Town, to get a FB friend request from the young Solo. Apart from returning, in a sincere way, to his family's religion of choice, Catholicism, he was content to produce 2 fine sons with his buxom but easygoing young wife. His new life was free of surprises and drama. He might have lived happily ever after, as, truthfully, he was enjoying being back in Africa. But his life was to take another turn following a dinner with the Minister of Finance and the Deputy Prime Minister. He was told that the dinner discussions were strictly off the record and that they wanted him to establish a new sovereign wealth fund of Nigeria, which would be receiving around $1 billion each month to invest. The fund should be run out of London and take a majority shareholding in the Nigerian bank, of which he was now CEO. He was told the first billion had already been transferred and that he could immediately set up the right administrative structure, and apart from a finance officer whom they would appoint, he could choose the entire board of directors. Amobi was torn between the relatively easy life he now had in Africa and a new challenge that would inevitably take him back to his old haunts of London, New York, Frankfurt, and the other capital centres of the world, where he had cut his teeth and was still well known and respected. He still had his investment management accreditation with the Financial Services Authority, and now, with his British passport, he felt he also had the protection of the leader of the Commonwealth. After agonizing over the choice for a week, he finally picked up the phone to the finance minister. "I'm in," Amobi said. "I will fly to London next week, and we should be up and running as soon as I have the regulatory approvals. A rubber stamp, I would imagine." Little did he know this sovereign wealth fund was really a blatant scam to divert government oil revenues via the fund to the offshore accounts of various ministers, senior military figures, and some shadowy men behind them. He would likely be allowed to run the fund for up to a year, and then, no doubt, would be arrested on one of his trips to Lagos and probably face his deathbed soon after from a potential heart attack, while the trail of the lost fund money went cold. Further blame would be levied on the investment bank advisors, the top accounting firm, and anyone else the real villains in Nigeria would find convenient to frame. Maybe what saved Amobi was not being the naive, westernized banker the leaders of the Nigerian cabal thought he was. So the cabal's nefarious plans went wrong early on. Seeing some big movement from the deposit of the first $1 billion, which he personally checked every day, Amobi put a top firm of investigators on their track. 3 days later, one of the senior directors of that small but very efficient firm called by his penthouse in Chelsea Harbour. There was not the usual call from the porter at the front desk, just a firm knock on his door. Through its glass eye, he saw the familiar features of Colonel Richard Hefford, ex of the regiment, before setting up Security Solutions International, the very expensive investigation and protection company. "Forgive me for seeking you out in your lair," Colonel Hefford said to him, "but your office may be monitored, and even your phone may not be secure. It seems your friends in Lagos are playing for huge stakes and have taken steps to keep tabs on you." "What the fuck are you talking about?" Amobi retorted, his features reflecting his shock. Over the next few hours, going through the small file that Colonel Hefford had carried with him, the veil was lifted. He gasped at how naive he had been from the very start. The quietly spoken colonel laid out the facts, mainly involving the ownership of the offshore accounts listed in his file. "So, it's pretty much the whole of the Nigerian national team," Amobi said in a sarcastic tone. With his attempt at making a feeble joke, he started to feel seriously depressed. He worried not only for himself, but also for his entire family, who might be held hostage to ensure his compliance. However, the colonel was one step ahead of him and tabled an extraction plan that could be put into immediate effect, shuttling them all down to Cape Town in South Africa, where, in a secure gated community, they would be relatively safe from attack or kidnap. What he outlined next was why his firm was paid huge sums to safeguard its very wealthy and varied client base. "Mr. Amobi, you are holding most of the cards right now, and once we have your family safely tucked away, practically all the cards," Colonel Hefford said. He let that sink in and continued, "You have control over a substantial sum of money, hundreds of millions of dollars. You can quite properly invest that and refuse to transfer any more of it to the gentlemen from Lagos. You also have proof that they helped themselves to the rest of the money, and, despite being rich and powerful, they could not escape arrest and are likely to be jailed anywhere in the world for what amounts to grand larceny and money laundering." Colonel Hefford shifted his weight from one leg to the other to get a bit more comfortable. "They would at best be at liberty in some dodgy place like Dubai or Panama, but unable to live any kind of normal life in Africa, Europe, or the US. one can assume they will be willing to strike a deal rather than risk discovery. That is your guarantee of safety, so long as you stick to the program we will set out for you. Sleep on it tonight and be at my office at 6 a.m. tomorrow, as we have no time to waste. No phone calls to your family in Nigeria, please, in the meantime. We don't want to give the cabal the heads up that you might be onto them." With that, the colonel stood, shook hands with an almost grey Amobi, let himself out by taking the lift directly to the underground car park, and disappeared into the night. Amobi took several deep breaths, poured himself a stiff scotch, and, after tossing and turning for 2 hours, eventually fell into a disturbed sleep, hoping he would wake up finding it was all a bad dream. The following morning, as the grey London sky greeted his 5 a.m. alarm, Amobi realized he must prepare himself for perhaps the toughest challenge of his life. He felt rage that this cabal had almost ruined his life, and probably would have kidnapped or even killed his entire family if they felt like it. So he would fix their safety first, and then take his revenge slowly. He remembered the old adage that revenge is a dish best eaten cold, so he needed to calm down and do things step by step. Thank God that foxy Colonel Hefford was on his side and knew the ropes. He was just a beginner at this kind of thing, but knew he would have to learn quickly to survive this existential threat to himself and those he loved. A few weeks later, a meeting took place on a large motor yacht, moored a short distance from Nice Airport. Present were Amobi, the Minister of Finance, and Colonel Hefford. The colonel was at his most urbane and had the first session alone with the minister. As he joined Amobi in the nearby stateroom, he laughed as he related how within 5 minutes the minister had offered him double his fees to deliver Amobi and all the evidence to his own security team. "Don't worry, old boy," Colonel Hefford said. "If we always went with the highest bidder, I would have retired already and life would be so dull on my Welsh sheep farm. This is what keeps me bright-eyed and bushy-tailed." To cut to the chase, they had removed the entire Amobi clan, almost en masse, down to Cape Town. South Africa pretty much let in any African with money, and there was a huge Nigerian community in situ already. The Amobi family would not have wanted to rub shoulders with most of them. Amobi himself would continue to run the fund for his share of the profits he generated. He asked and got an agreement for 20%. But this was in reality window dressing, as he would, more or less, be able to do whatever he wanted with the money. However, for reputational purposes, he insisted on making it appear all kosher. After all, he had the FSA to deal with in London, and the successors to the present government ministers in Nigeria might come knocking. Everything went their way, and they had video recordings of all the meetings with the minister who, judging by the expletives and threats he made, seemed not to have any grasp that small cameras and microphones can monitor most things. He was later sent a small extract, just to keep him focused. The cabal appeared to be neutered, hoisted by their own petard, but Amobi was still troubled that no one in Nigeria knew what a complete bunch of crooks was running that super-rich and powerful African nation. In turn, he invited one of the few people he trusted, who held a position of authority and respect, and who had been one of his father's closest friends, the general. He remembered that the general had a fine son called Solo, younger than Amobi, who had been educated in England and later became an officer in the Nigerian army. The general was no fool, and when Amobi called him to suggest lunch in Harry's bar in London, he did not protest that it was a long flight just for a lunch date. Did he suspect something? It did not matter, as what he had to tell that venerable military man would be best delivered face to face. He wondered if he should invite his other military friend, Colonel Hefford, but an inner voice advised against it. The colonel would likely not approve. Too bad. He was going to give the general at least an abridged version of events. Indeed, as they were finishing their starters of wild Irish smoked salmon garnished with a light dressing of a beluga-laced creme, he began to tell his story. For a moment, he had the sickening thought that maybe the general was one of the cabal, but remembered that while there were several offshore accounts attributed to Nigeria's finest, the general's name was not among them. "Funny coincidence, your story," the general said. "Amobi, these rascals did approach me some months back to join their gang of thieves. I sent them away with a flea in their ear, but I am sad to say some of my colleagues may have taken the tainted coin. I assume you have their names?" While Amobi outlined the scale of the scam and those involved, even the normally placid general's eyes widened, and more than once he took big gulps from the exquisite Petit Chardonnay, accompanying their main course of a magical steamed lobster with some exotic coconut sauce and fragrant rice. The stewards had to make frequent trips to keep his glass topped up, and by the end of their meal he appeared shaken but determined. "Say nothing about our meeting all the cabal. I will take matters into my own hands. We will stay in touch, and I will give you a special mobile number I can be reached on," the general said. Unfortunately, a week later, the general was dead, seemingly ambushed while traveling in a small military convoy visiting tribal chiefs in the Delta region. These chiefs were known to be hostile to the Lagos government, and sometimes even to the big oil interests that exploited their tribal lands. Reports in the press said that a group of local insurgents had attacked his convoy, but a local media source said that a bomb had been detonated inside his armored vehicle. Amobi felt guilty for involving his father's close friend and vowed again to take revenge on the cabal. They were certainly behind it, probably having determined that the general was about to move against them. The old warhorse was unlikely to have been very discreet once he got going. He did not know that his son Solo would go on a wild rampage of revenge, a kind of African Rambo, using all his special forces training to cause mayhem in the Delta region, targeting all those he thought might be responsible for his father's evident assassination. But it was not long before the authorities caught up and incarcerated him. No trial was set. It seemed they might be afraid of what Solo might say in open court. How much did he know? That was the background that led Amobi to become a major sponsor of disruption in the Delta region. Peter Amobi pursued that campaign so successfully that it was inevitable he would get flagged by the CIA. After all, they were there to protect American interests abroad, and Nigerian oil was a significant interest for them to protect. Would their recruitment of Solo help them get any closer to Amobi and shut him down? Or would the two see themselves as birds of a feather? Both had their freedom and lives on the line, but both cherished a deep love of Nigeria and hatred of the present government and big oil interests that pillaged without thought or mercy, neither giving a tinker's curse about climate change or anything else other than their own enrichment.